This is Freedom 1110, WKQA, Norfolk, serving Eastern Virginia and North Carolina with 50,000 watts of power and worldwide at WKQAradio.com. It's time for the Nora Firestone Show on Freedom 1110, WKQA. You're invited to be a part of the program by calling 757-222-3705. That's 757-222-3705.
Hello, Hampton Roads, and welcome to the Nora Firestone Show. Nora is away from the station today and is working on another project, so she asked me to sit in for her and guest host for her during the coming hour. My name is Drew Nickell. I have been on the Nora Firestone show frequently, and I hope you'll enjoy the broadcast. Today we're going to be discussing some of the issues surrounding the 2020 presidential election. But before we get into the broadcast, I would like to go ahead and announce the arrival of my second book, which is entitled All That Rendered Trump and What Led Up to His Election. This is a reprint of a book that I published back in 2016 regarding the events that led up to Trump's nomination, but the book was printed with information that arrived prior to that nomination. So it's being reprinted through another publisher now, Indignor House Publishing, and it is a reprint of Bending Your Ear, a collection of essays on the issues of our time, which I published in 2016. So both of those books are now available on Amazon.com, and signed copies of these books can be arranged through my own website, which is www.drewnickel.com, and I hope you will avail yourself of that resource, where I've published more than 400 essays in the 5 years that has existed, and you'll be able to get signed copies there. So again, that's www.drewnickel.com, and that's DREWNICKELL. Nora will be back next Thursday to resume her broadcast, and I appreciate her allowing me to sit in for it. So with that, let's get into election 2020. And with election 2020, what we're seeing is the confluence of stressors and its emerging truth. Now let's first define confluence. If you could picture different streams which flow ultimately into a river, that would be an example of a confluence. In other words, they're floating, or they're flowing, I should say, in the same direction to ultimately join together. And that's how creeks and rivers are formed. And what we are seeing is a confluence of stressors and the emerging truth regarding this election that is slowly but surely being revealed to us. In the not so coincidental confluence of dissimilar stressors, the greater truth of the 2020 presidential election emerges, and the truth which emerges shows more and more clarity with every passing day. Just consider coronavirus. The culpability of the Communist Chinese government in the worldwide spread of the coronavirus pandemic has been suspected ever since that government took measures to silence the growing calls from doctors connected with the government-owned and operated lab in Wuhan that a dangerous virus had been set loose and was rapidly spreading throughout China. Almost immediately, that government shut down flights within that nation to and from Wuhan, but continued to allow international flights regardless. That government almost immediately shut down the largest city in the Hubei province, that being Wuhan, while simultaneously insisting that the virus was not communicable between humans, and then lied about its very origin, trying to blame this on a live market in Wuhan where produce is sold. In actuality, this virus was developed in their own laboratories, but they lied about that. And these lies were echoed by the World Health Organization, which gave cover to the Chinese government while insisting that President Donald Trump's decision to shut down incoming flights from China was, quote, overreactionary, xenophobic, and bordered on racist. Democrats, including their eventual nominee for president, Joe Biden, echoed these same sentiments, but even Biden was reluctantly forced to admit later that the president acted wisely in his decision to stop inbound flights from China and later Europe, but not before they had already planted the seed of misinformation that was all Trump's fault in the way he responded to the emerging pandemic. Throughout Trump's actions, both during the initial and subsequent developments of this pandemic, Democrats continued to second-guess the president, yet offered no real alternatives to what the president was doing to ameliorate the effects of this pandemic. President Trump, along with his coronavirus task force, unleashed all of the engines of this nation's government and corporate entities alike to quickly ramp up production of sorely needed ventilators and the development of therapeutics aimed at combating the effects of the virus, particularly among the old and infirm. Trump launched Operation Light Speed to dramatically accelerate the development of a vaccine to prevent coronavirus infection by removing all of the usual regulatory and certification burdens which can slow the process of new such launches 3 years ago. In other words, the usual process of approving a vaccine takes 3 years with all the regulatory burdens. In doing so, in getting rid of those burdens, no less than 5 different pharmaceutical companies are now in the third and final stages of testing, and the president already unleashed the logistical expertise of the U.S. Army's Transportation Corps to be at the ready to distribute the vaccine just as soon as final approvals occur, all within the next several weeks, according to reports. So within the space of 9 months, the public and private sectors have come together to both treat coronavirus patients and protect the public from further infection with effective inoculation, a feat which knows no equal in the annals of pandemic history. In responding to the coronavirus, President Trump did all of this, yet what do we hear from Democrats now that a victory over coronavirus is within sight? Oh, Trump was slow to recognize the dangers of the virus, they say. Oh, Trump is dangerously rushing the development and launch of the vaccine just in time for the election and doesn't care about its safety or effectiveness, they say. And no one should trust any vaccine coming from Trump. Democrats insist that much of the economy remains shuttered, insist that schools remain closed, insist that masks and social distancing protocols remain in place for the foreseeable future. Some even insisting that Trump be impeached yet again, this time for his response to the coronavirus. When asked, albeit seldomly, just how they would have handled the response differently from how Trump handled it, they quickly changed the subject by either suggesting a non-existent rift between Trump and the scientists and doctors on his task force, or by condemning the president for conducting campaign rallies before large audiences without requiring that attendants wear masks. Given the great difference in enthusiasm between the two campaigns, it's no wonder why Democrats carp about these rallies, because deep down they know fully well that Biden could never draw such attendance nor as much enthusiasm for his own candidacy. Consider unrest in the streets. While no one could have foreseen the sudden onslaught of the virus, unrest from leftist radicals in the streets of cities where they are given such leeway by Democrat mayors and in states with Democrat governors began to emerge in the second term of the Obama administration. Yes, the unrest started back then. First, there was Ferguson, Missouri, followed by Baltimore, Maryland, both cities in which an African American suspect died at the hands of local law enforcement. The riots those incidents unleashed resulted in far more deaths and millions of dollars in destruction and looting, the harbinger of what was to follow George Floyd's death in Minneapolis 6 years later. Ever since Floyd's death, other cities erupted in violence, some as the result of similar incidents where police officers were forced to take lethal means to subdue suspects and effect arrests. Since the latest eruption of violence, which began in June, Democrat governors have refused to seek the deployment of their states' National Guards to put down the riots, a deployment repeatedly offered and encouraged by President Trump, while Democrat mayors have put the kibosh on local and state law enforcement to bring their streets under control. Yet the Democrats seek to blame Trump for all of this unrest, while completely dismissing the feckless inactions of their own gubernatorial and mayoral administrations, which have allowed this violence to continue. Police officers and civilians alike have been assaulted and even murdered in the weeks which have followed Floyd's death. Many thousands of businesses that have been looted and damaged beyond repair, and many of these same businesses which provide jobs to minorities have been forced to permanently close. How any of these actions help to end quote-unquote white privilege or combat endemic racism or bring justice at the behest of relatively few incidents where unarmed black men are actually killed by white police officers, typically not more than 10 or 11 each year, when tens of thousands of black Americans are killed by other black Americans each and every year, are beyond rational discussion. While blame for the unrest, which originally unleashed and even encouraged by the Obama administration, was never laid at the foot of Barack Obama's administration, all we hear is that the riots taking place in 2020 are the direct result of Donald Trump and the deep division that he purportedly sows in his tweets and rhetoric. Never at a loss for words, which abide criminals in the crime they commit, and which absolve violent felons from the life-changing results of their own assaults and even murders, Democrats seek to explain the inexplicable and transfer responsibility and culpability for violence away from those who condemn this violence. In other words, never, ever underestimate the power of Democrats and their co-collaborators in the media to exonerate their own while at the same time bring condemnation on Trump and their own Republican counterparts. It happens again and again and again. Consider international relations. While the arrival of coronavirus and the death toll that has emerged from it, over 200,000 today in the United States and just under 1 million deaths worldwide, has clouded other developments on the international front, we nevertheless see a drastic change in the status quo ante. For instance, ISIS and their infamous caliphate, which the Obama administration said that we would have to live with for the foreseeable future, their own words, has since been destroyed, all of their territory reclaimed by Syria and Lebanon. Thanks in large measure to President Trump's removing Obama's suicidal rules of engagement, which had hampered the effectiveness of our armed forces to lay waste to this radical Islamist extreme, we haven't heard any more of the beheadings and other brutal extreme punishments perpetrated by these radicals against Christian, Jew, and non-adherent Muslims alike. The ludicrous and ill-conceived Iran deal, which Obama and his second Secretary of State, John Kerry, put together to appease that nation and its criminal regime, has been effectively canceled by the by the Trump administration, drying up the financial resources Iran then used to foment terrorism throughout the world. Think about it. Our taxpayers' money, including $1.5 billion in cash. I can't even conceive of how much cash that is, but safe to say it was pallet loads, was delivered to the Iranian regime with nothing in exchange to curtail their development of nuclear weapons. This is what Obama and Kerry engineered in order to bring Iran into the family of nations. Arab states throughout the Middle East are now taking note of these developments and are slowly but surely isolating the Iranian regime and recognizing the disruptive influence that Iranian mullahs have and are subjecting the world. In September, President Trump successfully negotiated the first peace treaty between Israel and Arab nations, the first peace treaty in more than 26 years. In the so-named Abrahamic Accords, making reference to Judaism and Islam originating with the division that took place between Sarah and her handmaiden, and the division between Isaac and Ishmael. In the so-named Abrahamic Accords, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates have formally recognized now the State of Israel, joining Egypt, which in 1979, and Lebanon, which in 1994, in the formal diplomatic and trade relations with the Jewish state. As many as 9 other Arab states are soon to follow suit, further isolating the Islamist regime in Iran. President Trump has won worldwide recognition for this treaty, and along with the peace treaty he previously negotiated between Kosovo and Serbia, has twice been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, this time in recognition for all that he has accomplished to bring peace where there was once war. The last time an American president was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize was when Barack Obama was nominated for doing nothing other than being elected and then going around the world apologizing for the past sins of the United States of America. I don't know whether Trump will ultimately win this prize, but he's now been twice nominated, and for real accomplishments as opposed to implied, as with the Obama prize. Trump accomplished this latest treaty to the absolute dismay of globalists in the Obama and former administrations, most notably John Kerry, who insisted that the only way such a treaty could happen was by first settling the dispute between Israel and the Palestinians, long promised but perpetually short in realization for this lifetime anyway. So Trump bypassed that conundrum completely and then deployed his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, to enter into backdoor negotiations between the UAE and Israel. Once achieved, Bahrain quickly signed on, and thus history was made on the South Lawn of the White House when representatives of those countries, along with Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, signed formal accords on the South Lawn last week. Yet all we hear from Democrats and other globalists, as well as their co-conspirators in the media, is condemnation for an elusive peace treaty which they say excludes Palestinians. Yet no one, most certainly not the Trump administration, nor the Israelis, have prevented the Palestinians from signing on to the Abrahamic Accords. But then again, Trump accomplished what all of the so-called experts in Washington and New York could not have accomplished. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what bothers the living hell out of those people. How dare he go where they were unwilling and unable to go? Domestically, aside from the coronavirus and the uptick in urban unrest, Democrats are pulling out all of the stops to deny Trump a second term, where once they failed to prevent his uncanny nomination and election, and at the same time failed to destroy his presidency with a $45 million Mueller investigation, followed by an impeachment attempt, they are now resorting to seize electoral victory through fraudulent voting by means of mass distribution of unsolicited balloting via the U.S. mail. They have even gone so far as to promise an escalation in the violence we see in our streets if Trump is reelected, a modus operandi of voter extortion not seen in the history of the United States. The recent passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, regrettable yet altogether expected given her age and commendable battle with terminal cancer, has opened up a third vacancy on the nation's highest court during Trump's administration. Expressing absolute outrage that this president dare exercise his constitutional mandate to name Justice Bader Ginsburg replacement with a constructionist, read conservative, justice, not to mention doing so in an election year. How dare he? They would presume to tell the American people that Trump has no right to fill her seat. After all, they say, Bader Ginsburg's seat, as it were, should only be filled by a woman who shares Bader Ginsburg activist, read liberal, judicial philosophy, and their candidate for president insists that this woman be African American as well. So in a country governed by a constitution, which gives and mandates a president an entire 4-year term to exercise his explicit powers, and in a country which promises that all are created equal, such platitudes somehow don't apply when it comes to President Trump, as well as the selection of a Supreme Court justice. Trump should be proscribed from exercising his duty, while only a liberal African American woman nominated by a Democrat president is qualified to replace the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Democrats are even threatening to pack the Supreme Court with the addition of 6 more justices, presumably of their own philosophical, liberal, and activist bent, if Trump is allowed to select a 3rd Supreme Court justice, just as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt once tried to do in 1937 when the Supreme Court decided that certain elements of his New Deal were unconstitutional. Ever since Trump was elected, and in the wake of Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh being appointed, Democrats have clamored for this packing, so their latest threat to pack the court is nothing new in the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That aside, in the increasing likelihood of a disputed presidential election ending up at the steps of the Supreme Court, just as it did so in Bush versus Gore 20 years ago, will require a full complement of 9 justices to finally settle the election. Such a contingency cannot and must not wait until after the election, because the continuation of our nation thus hangs in the balance. President Trump knows this. Republicans in both houses of Congress also know this, as well as all of their Democrat counterparts. So this begs the question: why did Democrats, their nominated candidates, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, as well as Republican Senators Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, insist that the selection and confirmation of a new Supreme Court justice wait until after the election? Well, the answer to that is quite simple. None of them, Collins and Murkowski included, want Donald Trump to be reelected, and it's as simple as that. They would much rather see the nation suspended in the uncertainty and even in the further divide that would attend to such an extended and drawn-out contested election. The longer, the better. Remember, if this litigation goes beyond January 20th, 2021, Nancy Pelosi would effectively become acting president until such time as it ultimately is resolved. And that's what they want. That's what's behind these mailed-in voting. That's what is behind the reticence of Democrat and the reluctance for Trump to appoint a 9th justice. They want this to happen because it's the only way they can seize power. At this moment, in the final weeks of September, it looks like Republicans in the Senate will be able to proceed with the attendant hearings which follow Trump's selection, without the help from Senators Collins and Murkowski, now that Senators Mitt Romney of Utah and Cory Gardner of Colorado have given their assent to proceed. Trump has indicated he will announce selection on Saturday, September 26th at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham, the Republican of South Carolina, has already slated the week of October 12th for confirmation hearings, thus enabling a floor vote before Halloween and before this fall's election takes place. Let us all hope and pray that there is a fully functional 9-justice complement to the Supreme Court prior to November 3rd, because it looks like that's where this election is headed, one way or another. Now let's take a tally. Coronavirus, urban unrest, race relations, international relations, the potential for fraudulent balloting, and the Supreme Court vacancy are but 6 dissimilar but altogether confluent stressors from which the emerging truth of this year's election is revealed, despite the efforts of the media to disguise this truth and camouflage the real differences between Trump and Biden. Now, on Tuesday the 29th, the first debate between Trump and Biden will take place, and I promise you it will reveal even more differences between these two candidates, both in style and substance. One candidate who solves problems, while the other pontificates platitudes just as he has done so for the last 47 years. So ask yourself, before you make that selection, what you're going to do to make sure this country survives. Because if Trump is not reelected, and given the radicals which surround the potential Biden administration, it's something that we all have to consider, because this may be our last opportunity to save this country from ourselves. And that's what Trump's presidency is all about. When you look at Donald Trump and you consider his uncanny election, you have to ask yourself, why would a man so steeped in wealth, so steeped in recognition and acclaim for his business acumen, why would such a man want to leave the comforts of an assuredly luxuriant retirement to be president of the United States? The toughest job any person could ever undertake. John F. Kennedy once said that the principal problem in the presidency is that presidents are confronted with many options, all of which are bad. And the secret of their success lies in their ability to select the least bad options when confronted with a crisis. Well, one might look at that and say President Kennedy was absolutely right. The president is faced with bad choices, and the trick is to make the least bad choice when he's confronted with a decision. Now, again, here's a man, multi-billionaire, successful businesses in all modes of industry, and successful in his promotion of beauty contests and sporting events and even his own show, The Apprentice. Why would he want to walk away from all of that luxury and comfort and take on the most difficult job in the world? Well, it sure as hell wasn't for the money. He had plenty of that. In fact, every paycheck he's drawn has been divvied up quarterly to various branches of the government in order to help them with their finances. So, in effect, Trump has taken no salary, not a dime, since he's become president. So we know money wasn't the object. I mean, it wasn't like Obama, who entered the first presidential election in 2008 with a net worth of about $400,000. Now he's worth $15 million. So we know he made money on being president. But Trump isn't into making more money. He's made plenty. He's made enough for his grandchildren to live in luxury. So money is not the motivation. So what else could it be? Well, I have a theory. And this is backed up by Trump's own recollection of the 2012 election. That night, he saw the feckless and hardly Republican Mitt Romney lose badly to Barack Obama. And Mitt should have easily won that election, but he was too timid in criticizing his opponent. So Obama was reelected. Trump would, I mean, excuse me, Mitt Romney was soundly defeated. And Trump was watching this on TV and said, okay, this is enough. If I don't do something, we're going to see this country fall apart. So that night, while he was watching television alone, he decided to run for president and even came up with a slogan, "Make America Great." He called his attorney that night and had that slogan copyrighted. Well, the next day he had to call his attorney back and said, you know, the problem with "Make America Great," it sounds like America's never been great. So let's change it to "Make America Great Again." And so is formed the inspiration for millions of ball caps you see around the country, much less an entire presidential campaign. So "Make America Great Again" was the slogan with which Donald Trump began his quest. And when he came down the escalators in June of 2015 to announce his candidacy, everybody took it as a joke. Oh, this is a stunt. This is his latest attempt at getting press attention, because Donald Trump, let's face it, for 4 decades was a master at manipulating media coverage. We all know that. And yet, there was something in his announcement that rang true. And within 2 months, I predicted in an essay that now appears in my books, both the Bending Your Ear and the All That Rendered Trump books, that not only could he win the nomination, but he might even win the election. And I can tell you right now, friends of mine on Facebook thought I was dead crazy. They told me that, oh, Drew, you're way off. You don't know what you're talking about. Trump will not receive the nomination because too many Republicans hate him and he can't be elected. Well, guess what happened? One by one of all his Republican adversaries fell by the wayside, while he laid waste to the candidacies of those go along, get along with Republican milquetoast that didn't have enough gumption to criticize Obama the way he should have been criticized. He gets the nomination. Then he's in the debates with Hillary Clinton, who, according to Democrats, deserved to be president, given all that she'd gone through over the years to try to get there. Once again, the media blatantly took her side, even in the debates and all of the debates. They ganged up on Trump at Hillary's behest. And yet, what did Trump do? He took her head on. When Hillary Clinton said that the Justice Department would suffer under President Trump, and that the powers at the Justice Department would not be just in the Trump presidency, Trump said she would be in jail if it were left up to him. And that moment was when Trump defeated Hillary Clinton, because she couldn't come back at him, and neither could the moderators. When Trump said those words, "You'd be in jail." It was that night that Trump won the election, although we didn't find that out until a couple of weeks later, when election 2016 occurred. He won the election in the face of all that media unity against him, and in the face of the Obama administration trying to tear apart and sabotage his campaign through spying and illegal wiretaps and illegal surveillance. They got permission from the FISA court to continue this surveillance of his operatives, and that even continued throughout the election, after his election, and even after his inauguration, when the spying took on the mission of busting apart his presidency through the Mueller investigation, all based on a dossier that Hillary Clinton paid for, along with the Democratic National Committee, that made up a whole bunch of salacious and unverified stories about Trump and his activities in Russia. 3 years and $45 million later, what do? they say, well, we couldn't find evidence that he colluded with the Russian to rig the election against Hillary Clinton, and we can't really find anything substantial to suggest that he obstructed justice either, which was the two counts of the impeachment hearing. They went on with impeachment to say that Trump would be impeached because of a conversation he had with the newly elected president of Ukraine. Supposedly, he dangled military and financial assistance in exchange for dirt on Joe Biden. That didn't take place, but that didn't keep the Democrats from desperately seeking impeachment through formal impeachment hearings. And again, there was no meat on that bone. So let's recount. They launched a 3-year, $45 million investigation to see if Trump colluded with the Russians, which he didn't, and then tried to impeach him based on a phone call he had with the Ukrainian president. And that failed. And now they want to impeach him again just to stop him from naming a Supreme Court justice. Do they even realize how their credibility is absolutely shot to hell? This is how desperate they are to keep him out of office? You have to ask yourself why. They didn't do this to Bush, either one of them. They didn't do this to Reagan. They didn't do any of this. But Trump upset a very lucrative, bipartisan, globalist, and internationalist apple cart, which all of these opposing politicians in both parties oppose Trump for. Because let's face it, between the Chinese, the Russians, and lobbyists, both international and domestic, that seek to sway legislative action in their own favors, have spread the mother's milk of money across the capital of the United States and turned it into a veritable whorehouse. The whores being the politicians that take these bribes, and the Johns being the lobbyists who give them this money. And that's why they're all against Trump, because he wants to bust the whole thing wide open. And if Trump is reelected, then he will pull out all of the stops and expose this to all to see the corruption that is endemic to our nation's capital. In the second Trump term, we will find out just how deeply this corruption goes. And that scares the hell out of Democrats and Republicans in Congress alike, because their gig will be up. Now, let's suppose that Trump loses this election. I don't think it's likely. It's certainly not going to happen if the election is legitimate, but I'm beginning to believe that word "if" is the longest word in the English language, because we know there are efforts afoot to defraud this country of a legitimate election and oust Trump regardless of the division that will take place. So, going along with this idea that eventually Biden is elected, a couple of things will happen. First, the Supreme Court will be packed, because Biden's election would almost certainly mean a Democrat takeover of the Senate and a retention of their majority in the House of Representatives. And given those scenarios, there will be nothing to stop the Democrats from ending the filibuster. There will be nothing to stop the Democrats from eliminating the Electoral College in our presidential elections. There will be nothing to keep Democrats from insisting that there be 15 justices on the Supreme Court, which would effectively reverse the direction of the court for decades to come. And the effects of all of that will be the elimination of the Republican Party as we know it. Because the concept of divided government, the concept of the balance of powers, will be destroyed in a Biden presidency. Why? Well, first of all, Biden is too mentally weak and too impaired to carry on a responsible generation, which means he will turn over power either to Speaker Pelosi or to his Vice President Kamala Harris, who has already been labeled as the most liberal member of the Senate. She's to the left of Bernie Sanders, and that's doing something. To be the left of an avowed socialist, to be the left of him, that's saying something. Harris let it slip last week in a comment on a press conference that in a quote-unquote Harris administration, and then she quickly corrected herself to mean an Harris administration with Biden as president would do X, Y, and Z. I don't recall any administration in the entire history of this country that was named by the name of their vice president. It sure as hell isn't the Pence administration. It sure as heck wasn't the Cheney administration or the Agnew administrations or the Rockefeller administration or the Nixon administration during the 1950s. All of those administrations were called by the name of the president, as they should be, because even though we send electors in the Electoral College to vote for the president and vice president of a ticket, we all know that it's headed by the presidential candidate in all cases, but not this year, because something is afoot with Biden and Harris. Now, I can't say for certain what will happen, but I can tell you odds are that Biden won't be president long before we see that it's really being run by Kamala Harris and or Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. And this is what is behind all of this. This is why they selected a weak candidate who would be easy to control, because the leftist socialists who are also in Washington, the AOC and the Squad, are bound to determine to effect a socialist revolution in this country which borders on communism. The violence fomenting in the street are being perpetrated with their support in both the Antifa realm and in the Black Lives Matter realm. Antifa, their aim is to sow absolute anarchy throughout the United States in order to bring this government down. Black Lives Matter has stated in their manifestos that they seek worldwide Marxist single world government dictatorship. That's what they want. Politicians and corporations who are even funding Black Lives Matter are afraid to point this out, but it nevertheless is true. They are an organization seeking Marxism throughout the world. And by the way, a lot of Americans don't know that Black Lives Matter also has protests taking place in a lot of countries across the ocean. But we don't hear about that. Corporations have caved to their dictates, and all of this rioting is being encouraged by Democrats because they want to make this country miserable. So miserable that they won't reelect Trump. And given the riots and continued ridiculous mandates to wear masks and social distancing, and I know fully well that the masks don't work, and that's a topic for an entirely another show. What they seek to do is to make this country so miserable that there is no way Trump would be reelected. And they don't care how miserable we are, how many businesses fail, how many restaurants never reopen again, how the schools will remain to be closed, and children will thus suffer at the lack of regular and rudimentary education. And they're willing to abide all of this violence, all of the killing, all of the murder, if they can make the country miserable enough to oust Donald Trump from office. And the media is reinforcing this deception on a daily basis. Quickly, I'll go through a personal example. I once talked to a relative of my wife's. I won't name her or indicate how they are related, but I once talked to her about this election when she said, "Oh, it's the worst of the worst. It's the worst of the worst." And she did not realize anything that Trump has done, because where does she get her news? From the networks and CNN. So she's told that Trump is this horrible ogre who doesn't know how to be presidential and lies on every occasion. And this is what she's been led to believe, and she believed it with all of her heart. And when I ticked off the number of things that Trump has accomplished during his presidency, she kept saying, "I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I didn't know that." To the point where it was as if she just arrived here from another planet. I don't blame her. She bases what she believes to be true based on what she is fed by the media. And our media, let's face it, is no longer the fourth estate practicing freedom of the press. They have become a communications wing of the Democratic Party. All of the media, Fox News included. Yes, there are certain hosts on some of Fox's shows, notably Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham, who tell us the truth, but too much of Fox News has gone the way of CNN and the networks. And now what are we faced with? How do we get our truth? The newspapers across the country have been lying to us all along. So we have to dig deep. We have to juxtapose Trump's accomplishments, his accomplishments, against the tweets that offend some of us. Well, I'll tell you about those tweets, because I know a lot of voters, particularly suburban women, are offended by his tweets and are taken aback by his outward behavior in office. Trump is a lot of things, but he's no politician. He will never be a politician, because politics is the art of making the lie believable. And no one can accuse Donald Trump of hiding who he is or what he believes. He comes out with it. Filters removed, not cognizant of political correctness, and he says what he thinks. That's something we haven't had in this country for a long, long time. And he is unapologetic in his excoriation of biased fake news, in his excoriation of Democrats and Republicans alike opposed to his presidency. He lets them have it, and they can't stand that either. They would have him cower and fall, as they were hoping to do with the Mueller investigation. They were hoping that he would just be weak like some of his predecessors and give up and resign the presidency. That's what they dreamed about, and they couldn't accomplish it. And now they're trying to defraud the nation in denying Trump a second term through bogus balloting and fake news and absolute lies about Trump, and trying to deny him his constitutionally mandated obligation to see to it that Justice Ginsburg is replaced on the high court. We are in a very, very dangerous time. This country is on a teeter-totter. It's on a seesaw, because on one hand you have the left, and on the other hand you have what I'll conveniently call the right, although it can be argued Trump is no ideologue, but he is a nationalist. He is somebody who puts America first. And that's something else we haven't seen since the presidency of Ronald Reagan. We've gone through years and years and years of globalist, internationalist administrations from both parties, all who have exported our jobs and our economic and military strength across the seas in the effort to drive the world into a one-world government. Trump won't have any of that. He says the United States is first, foremost, and always. He believes in the concept of buying American and hiring Americans. And that's what brought about, along with his regulatory reform and tax cuts, that's what brought about the strongest economic recovery in the history of this country. And that was suddenly stopped by the arrival of a coronavirus. And I have to ask myself, was that unleashing of the virus intentional by the Chinese, as it seems like it was? And if they so intended, that's an act of biological war and crimes against humanity. But those crimes won't be prosecuted if Joe Biden is elected president. They'll be allowed to continue. So I see from our clock that we are getting near the hour where this episode of the Nora Firestone Show will come to an end. And we've talked about a lot of things today, a lot of different things that we need to be considering in the next 5 or 6 weeks that are going to be this election season. I hope and pray that this election will be carried off without event, but I fear the opposite. I fear that this election will end up being hung in the balance, and along with it, our nation. So please, give all of this consideration. Don't go by what you're told, but what you research and find out on your own. Because you have to vote, and you cannot refrain from doing what's best for our country if you care at all about the future of this country. And those of you who want to believe that the United States is the root of all evil and a force that has only imposed racism on the world, remember it was the United States who had a war to settle the issue of slavery once and for all, where almost 700,000 Americans died in settling that issue. And all of the strife which has taken in the years since in the struggle for civil rights, look where we have come based on where we began. And stop piling on this disrespect extended to the United States, because if it wasn't for the United States and Britain, slavery would still exist worldwide as it does in too many countries today. And we must recognize that as well. So which United States do you want? Do you want a nation that has been torn asunder through division and lies? Or do you want a strong, robust nation that leads the world towards a better world? Think about this as we go from today onward to an election. Don't forget to look up my website, www.drewnickell.com, for the latest essays, which are also searchable by topic. And I hope you all enjoy this magnificent September day, and all the best to all of you, with special thanks to WKQA, Freedom 1110 on our AM dial, and the good people that manage that station, along with Nora Firestone, who's given me the opportunity to present in her stead today. I wish you all of the best, and don't forget to vote. Thank you.